Hello and welcome back, everyone. Thank you all for joining me again. This is going to be the second part of my 2025 Art Challenge review, basically, in the last video, which ended up being about 30 minutes long, so thank you for everyone who watched that. But in the last video, I went over the first 6 months of this art challenge, and in this one, I'm going to go over the second 6 months. That I've been doing this weekly art challenge for. Before we look at that, you can see that this book is very much so overstuffed. And we'll probably be thankful that it is no longer going to be stuffed with new pieces of art. But without much further ado, we can start to take a look at what I've done over the last 26 weeks over here. Just as review, this is the last one we looked at in the other video. And our very first one here, you can see, is this image featuring a woman floating over a city. This woman, she is from a painting by an artist named Elihu Vedder, and she is surrounded by this kind of floating fabric egg almost, that almost glows from the interior. And so behind her, I have this wooden picture or mirror frame that is supposed to look like a sun, right? So she's kind of shining out from the center of that. Behind her is an image of the planet Jupiter with its swirling clouds and this very blue tone in the background. And then below her and in the foreground, you can see these streets kind of angling towards the center of the painting over there. I believe this is Paris in the 1930s or so, but maybe don't quote me on that one. Next up, we have this image over here, which is going to be the mouth of Orcus from Bomarzo, Italy. I don't think it's like an ancient sculpture, but it is certainly one that is very, very striking. I have these rocks, this kind of rugged terrain in the front of it, kind of to anchor it to this sort of wilderness where it's out there in the middle of, nowhere. With these glowing orange, this glowing orange light coming from its eyes and mouth. And then you have this figure over here making their way into it. I like to think of it as being like maybe a sleepwalker walking into a world of, the unknown, or maybe kind of a nightmarish thing. The figure over there, that is going to be from an artist named Benjamin Koenig, who I follow on Instagram, who does a lot of really, really great work. But I liked that image of what I like to think of as like a sleepwalker. And so I used that for this guy. Next up, we have a painting I did. This is gouache and a little bit of acrylic in there and some inks there, but it's going to be on, instead of paper, it's actually painted on a piece of bark that my dad found in his yard. It is a fairly large chunk of bark, maybe about 8 inches by 4 or 5 inches or so. And it is going to be one that I covered the back with mulberry paper so that it would be strong and wouldn't flake away. And then I painted these two figures on here, which are kind of, floating in, this kind of cosmic dream. You can see they are connected by a cord of light. So, some different things you could maybe read into that, but it's a nice, fun one. After that, I have these two images here. This first one is going to be a kind of juxtaposition. You have this kind of very old, maybe even antique window frame, and through it you see this very modern, very techy, glitched out city here. That's also a fairly distressed image. You can see there's a lot of distortion going on with it. You have this kind of rainy image here. And the woman that was in there, I cut her out, and in the background I have this field of blue flowers that I felt really echoed the I guess you could say ruralness or antique ruralness of this picture frame, this window frame, versus the urban setting of the city there. Next up, we have a fairly simple image of my boy Carl. You can see he is looking quite dapper over here. There is this image here of an 18th century, landowner that I cut out and put Carl's face over there. There was an artist maybe about 10 years ago who did images like this, people's pets. That was very, very common back then. So I thought I would make my own version of that for my boy Carl there. Next up, we have a couple of images here, and the next 3 images are actually related, as you'll see pretty obviously there because they all use the same sort of central figure here, which is done by an artist named Jen Anderson. I took this very kind of swirling chaos silhouette in the middle there, and I put that with this image of a doorway on a beach. I cut out the sky and added this kind of more what I felt to be kind of an unearthly, unreal sky, like that of a dream, and it's almost as if you're stepping into this doorway, into this another dream here. But while I was thinking of this image, I thought of different ways of using it, and so those were used in the next two images over here. This one, you can see that same sort of figure here, or the same figure exactly, done with different art papers, different textured papers, different patterns, to create this kind of cocoon of colors and textures around the central figure over there. And then the last image with that figure, we can see here, I took the center of that and used it as this sort of titanic figure to stand above a city. Either you could argue menacingly, or maybe it's just a mysterious figure. It's unknown what that is, right? But you have this cityscape in the background with the buildings and this large figure in the middle. And then in the foreground, you have this image over here of this person, maybe standing off against that. I like to think of it kind of like, old video game art where you have your protagonist in the foreground standing up against, some menace in the background. This picture here, this painting, is from an artist named Pascal Blanche, who, again, I follow on Instagram, but I really love their artwork. I like the kind of the techno pipe kind of video gaming nature of it, so I like that one. This next one here is a painting I did, gouache on watercolor paper. You can see that it's using the same sort of idea that I used in the painting on the piece of bark there, of this white figure in this cosmic background surrounded by, this kind of ribbon of white there. This one I painted for my mother for her birthday. Our next couple images are here. We have this one here. A lot of things going on here, a lot of kind of clash and riots of patterns and color there. The central figure, which is almost like a ballerina, that is going to be by an artist named Danilo Martinez. And then you have this kind of labyrinth around her over here, and she's kind of breaking a little bit from the picture frame, right? So I really like that one. And then the next week I did this, and this is one of the ones that's maybe in competition for maybe one of my favorite pieces. You have this central sort of little rabbit figure sitting on a mushroom, and you can see that her story has kind of come to life with dragons and ships and maps all around her swirling. The rabbit comes from a sculpture by an artist named Moko Kumakichi, who does a lot of these kind of woodland figures, which is exactly my sort of vibe. I love that. And I felt like that worked really, really well with this image. Next up, we have these two here. This one actually has a fairly interesting story. I found this image of this statue in Ecuador while I was playing a game of GeoGuessr with my students, and we just happened to plop right there, and I turn around and I see this amazingly beautiful statue, and so I'm scrambling to try to write down exactly where it is and trying to figure out what the statue is and everything, but I ended up finding it, and I used it for this image. So I mirrored her. You can see her on both sides, and she's standing in this kind of alcove. At the top, you can see a golden disc. That is from the Voyager spacecraft. That's, traveling off into the distance of space there. And you have our Three of Swords kind of hanging above it all with these veins of gold, which could also be maybe gold lightning strikes in the image. Very kind of tarot sort of figure here. I like that one. And this one here. This one is interesting. I have this figure over here, which I believe is from an artist named Virginia Frances Sterrett, who is another kind of 1800s illustrator who I really, really like. She is sitting on this beast sort of statue, kind of somewhere between a bovine figure and maybe a bit more of an antelope. It's kind of a fantasy creature over here, by an artist named Kokomusu Moko, who I follow on Instagram as well. The background, this archway, is another piece by an artist named Nona Lyman, who does amazing kind of dreamlike photography. And this moon is from a postcard. All right. Next view over here. This one is interesting here. This is a lovely carpet piece. It has this kind of like lovely textile texture to it. And then in the center, there was an image there that I cut out and used a little bit later on in the book. But here you can see that you have a astronaut on the moon. That's Alan Bean, who's actually an amazing artist in his own right, that if you ever get a chance to check out his work, is really, really cool. But Alan Bean walked on the moon. He was on the Apollo 12 mission, and that's an image of him. And then you can see Alan Bean, instead of finding the whatever he finds on the moon, he finds this gigantic figure of Venus there. I really kind of like the juxtaposition. I like the kind of border aspect of here, this huge carpet textured border, and then this small image in the middle. But that is contrasted with this guy over here, which is maybe my favorite image in the entire book, the thing that I like the most. You have this image of a sleeping figure surrounded by books. This is going to be a illustration by a guy named Franklin Booth, who did a lot of work in the late 1800s into the early 1900s with authors like Frank L. Baum, who did like The Wizard of Oz and everything. But floating above him is this sword, flanked on both sides by this kind of spectral, ghostly figure, which comes from an artist named Paulina Washington, who does these very kind of, once again, unearthly photography, I guess you would say. A lot of neon colors, very, very moody. I like that. And then the background, which you're going to see a lot of similar style backgrounds in the next, few images here. Those come from a book from the 1500s about comets, and that's called the Cometan Book, which is going to be a beautiful repository of these images that have this beautiful kind of color palette they use for the skies, very dreamlike. I really love them, and you're going to see I use them all the time in some of the remaining images over here. But that maybe is my favorite one of the whole year. Next up, we have this one here. This one is going to be fairly simple image. It's really only two elements, right? We have our wooden polychrome statue of a weeping Virgin Mary with these very beautiful tears. The artist really captured the emotion in the eyes of the statue. And you can see in the foreground there is this gentleman in silhouette, and that was a homeless man sitting on the bank of the River Seine in Paris in the 1930s. And the words I overhear is, "I keep the dream of a better time, but for now I cry all the tears," which comes from a song by the band Gojira. Pretty on the nose there what that one's about there, but I really like those ones. Another one of our images that use that same 1500s comet book over here, but this time with another giant figure. This one is a figure from a painting by an artist, Michael Whelan, who is an amazing painter and illustrator, has done a lot of illustration, book cover art for people like Isaac Asimov for the Foundation series, or probably most famously Stephen King with The Dark Tower. But all of his work is really, really good. And I really like this one. And it featured this woman here kind of tiptoeing her way through an unearthly landscape. And I felt that look would really, really good with her kind of tiptoeing through this city over here, with, once again, those beautiful kind of comet tones in the background. I really like this one too. Next up, we have another pair of related images here. This one is going to feature a sculpture of the huntress goddess Artemis by Paul Manship. You can see she's been placed on this floral kind of forest scene background with this. I really like the metallic cardstock that I used to kind of separate her out from that background, right? And then above her, there is a piece of brass that is been patterned and shaped to kind of look like a crescent moon over there, which I thought looked really, really good with the goddess over here. And her companion is going to be a statue by the artist Forrest Rogers. This one's called Persephone. And I used that metallic cardstock to create this kind of envelope of flame around her. The background is this beautiful purple. I love the vibe by it, and that's by that artist Nona Lyman, who we saw earlier with that other image there. But I really like these two together. Next up, we have this guy here. This is a very kind of Eastery sort of piece, although I made it in like November or something like that. This is gouache, and even though it's a painting, it's also technically a collage because I painted it at two different times. The foreground elements I painted during a meeting of this art club that I do, and then I had it all just by itself, and I wanted it to fit with something. So I painted this kind of oval background with this kind of sunset, very pastel vibes, and I put these two together, and I really, really like the way that turned out. This next one, another sort of dream image over here of a figure floating off into the sky, surrounded by a kind of envelope of, maybe kind of dream energy or something like that, psychedelic energy. Kind of like that one. Very simple. And then we have our last two comet paintings over here. This one uses a lot of similar elements to that very first one. We have a Frank Booth illustration of this woman looking up at a figure in the sky. And in this case, the figure is going to be this ghostly apparition of a woman bearing a sword. And that one is going to be by a artist named Naya Kotko. She does a lot of very, I would say, like witchy sort of photographs, and I really like this one over here. And behind her, this sort of architectural element comes from a sculpture by a guy named Matthew Simmons, who does these completely marble carved architectural sculptures, right? That are very, very intricate and very, very beautiful. So I used those ones for this guy here. And their companion is this guy here. You have this image of an angel, maybe weeping, maybe tired, who knows. But she's standing on this sort of rocky precipice, and behind her you have a world in flames and chaos. And above her, an image of the Tower of Babel, which actually came from our previous image over, let me find it. Hold on. Here. Yeah, that's the image that came from the center of that one, that Tower of Babel. But yeah, kind of, like I said, those comet images are really, really hitting the spot when it comes to their color choices. I really like the palette that they used. Really like them. All right, moving into the final stretch here, we have this image over here, which is super interesting in its own right. You have a central female figure, I guess at the bottom central over here, surrounded by this swirl of color, surrounded by these words, these concentric rings over here. The statue in the middle, that's going to be by an artist named Valerie Hadida. And the background is actually a palette, a paint palette that I had for a very long time. That I decided to use for this whole project. Surrounding these kind of concentric rings are a bunch of words, kind of a repeating sort of mantra or phrase that I put on over there. What's interesting about this, it's actually on the background of a previous work, this one here. So this is painted on put down on a piece of wood, and on the back of that wood is this palette over here, which is kind of a nice double use of that same piece of wood, but I really like this one. And then coming to the last two images, we have this one here, Take Your Time. This one has a few different elements going on. You have this floral background, and then punching through it, you have this keyhole of light and tranquility, and leading to it, you have this path of grass, of nature, leading the person to there. And that central figure is from a piece of art by Carl Gustav Karras. And those all together kind of create this kind of, the vibe of someone walking into their own world, right? But, I really like that one. And then the final one is going to be, of course, my own self-portrait here. This one I did in the style of one of my favorite artists, Edward Gorey, who does, these ink line drawings, very heavily hatched. I'm not very good at hatching yet, so I didn't really do too much of that here. But you have this black and white drawing of myself here on this fairly gothic-y background. To lean into the Edward Gorey vibes, this frame that I put this stuff in is actually from an Edward Gorey illustration that I put myself into the middle of. But I wanted to anchor it in kind of this playfulness that you find in Edward Gorey's work, and that it would be like a portrait on a wall, right? So I have this fancy kind of background, which reminded me of a wallpaper that I painted a shadow under, where, of course, my portrait is. And then I have a line, of course, hanging it up. And I use a little bit of metallic paper, which you can kind of see the reflection of, to make the nail to stab it into. And that ended my year, of course. And there we have the 2025 Art Challenge, all done and dusted in the books. And for next year, for 2026, I'm going to do the same thing. But instead of this little book over here, I went ahead and bound another book of a little bit different proportion. This one, very, very kind of rectangular, very small. This one also pretty small, but maybe a little bit of a better kind of form factor here. With our slightly bigger than 5x5 squares. I bound this one with a Coptic stitch. Instead of it being just 52 pages, though, it's 104 pages, so that I can do my art all on maybe just one side of the paper, and then on the back ends of the pages, I can write up explanations or information about what I've done, just to make it a little bit easier for myself. But in any case, thank you for watching this video. We'll see if in the next year I make more of them. But if you sat through this whole thing, thank you. Maybe leave it a little bit of a like. And even if you didn't make it all the way through, I'm glad that you were here to begin with. Have a great rest of your year.